So we are ending this beautiful season of Easter and resurrection. And next week we have Pentecost, and then we have this very long season of 30-something weeks of the Sunday of Pentecost, And so we're kind of basking in the resurrection glow for one last Sunday. And I kind of want to stay with that. And we are about to say goodbye to the Gospel of John that we've been reading over these last few weeks. So I want to kind of tie that in. But the idea that Jesus is leaving us is the theme. Ascension Day was this week, and Christian art has depicted Jesus as ascending in glory with the light and his robes blowing in the wind. And you think of these wonderful paintings by Titian, these wonderful masters that are hung in our great cathedrals and churches. And I remember looking at one of these paintings one time, and the apostles are all kind of standing back like this, and as Jesus is ascending into heaven, and somebody wrote a little bubble coming out of Jesus' mouth, "Help me, you idiots, the aliens are taking me." And sometimes, the church doesn't get it right. "Help me, you idiots," is Jesus' prayer. And the gospel that we just read today is Jesus' prayer that is created by this magnificent Gospel of John. And it's 4 chapters. It's chapter 13 through chapter 17. And you have kind of Jesus thinking out loud. The context is the upper room, the Last Supper, before he's about to be arrested and crucified. And he's kind of thinking out loud and praying for these idiots that are going to become the leaders of the church. And he's thinking out loud, and he's talking about all sorts of things, about them being in the world, but they're not of the world, and I'm not of the world, and entrusting them to the care of the Creator. And what I know of you, I've told them, and they belong to you, and we're all one. And there are memories, there are snippets of memories from this rambling of Jesus before he's about to be taken out and executed. And they're put into this magnificent gospel. And I think of John's gospel as a great cathedral. I want you to imagine in your head your favorite cathedral in Europe, say, or St. John the Divine, right? And you walk into that building and you think of the energy and the work that it has taken to create these stones that are piled on one another. And up and up and up they go. And if you're lucky, maybe you're there in the morning and you're there alone. And the sun is coming in, and there are these flying buttresses that are pushing the walls in from outside, and there are these beams that are pushing the walls out. So you have these forces like, I'm in the world, but I'm not of the world. Protect them from the evil one. Keep them good. Keep them living in truth. You have these forces, and the cathedral epitomizes the tension of the forces that hold up this magnificent 1,000-year-old building, and there is a silence. And it's glorious. And Jesus talks about glory, giving glory to God. The Greek word is doxa. There's lots of, in John's gospel, this word is used more than any other of the gospels. All of the gospels combined. The glory, that it's all about the glory. And you think of the glory of a cathedral and the forces that are holding that, the fragility of that in place. And the cathedral is not created by one person. It is created by a community. It is maybe the dream of a king or a baron or a bishop or an archbishop, but it's the artisans who carved their faces into the stonework and into the gargoyles. And we all have our fingerprints in this great cathedral that takes generations to finish. And every now and again, there will be a chapel added that will be from a different period, but the architect will make it work and look as if it's always been, rather like when we put our rail in. Remember that? And now it's always looked like it's been here. So if an architect is really good, it will look as if it's one piece. And that's what we have in John's Gospel. It looks like it's one narrative, but it's not. It's all these fragments and pieces of memory and different traditions and hopes and fears. And also what's magnificent about it, it's looking to the future. So it's a kind of bridge to an age that can only be imagined. When the Gospel of John was put together, the mission to the Jewish community was failing. And so the Gospel isn't written in Aramaic or Hebrew, it's written in Greek. It is written for the generations to come. It is written for people yet unborn, like the great cathedral awaits us. The gospel can be divided into two parts. The first 12 chapters, they describe the public ministry of Jesus. And it's often been described as the book of signs. So it's all the miracles and the stories of Jesus. So it's like the nave of the cathedral, with all the windows that tell the stories of what Jesus was up to on earth. And then from chapter 13 on is the book of glory. And we're stepping into the sanctuary where the altar is. There's more ornate carvings. The altar represents the sacrifice of Jesus on the altar, on the cross. So we're inside the sanctuary. And so this prayer that is in this part of John's gospel is from the book of glory. And then you had this editor who comes by, who's this master architect who weaves together these different parts to create this wonderful story that is part of our Easter celebration of resurrection. And what's beautiful about this prayer is Jesus is not only praying for his disciples, but he's praying for the church. He's praying for us, for the church that is to come. Behind me is this description of Jesus the intercessor, the Christus Rex. He is wearing the clothes of a priest. He is interceding for the church that is here and the church that is to come. So theologically, that is what's going on. And he's using glory. He's talking about giving glory to God, doxa. And he's talking about another Greek word, sarkos, which means to be of the earth, the flesh. And that this tension, how the flesh and how the sarkos and the doxa, like this great cathedral, can create this magnificence. And how the church, how the people of God to come will continue to do that. And it's interesting for preachers, we love the Easter season because there's so much to kind of pay attention to. And then we go into Pentecost, and it's a bit like the summer. I remember this week looking up at some trees. They were freshly blossoming, and there was this bright lime. I don't know if it was a chestnut, but it was this vibrant green, and an elm tree, like Japanese elm, in front of it that was golden and red and fiery, and the sun hit it, and it was just alive. And only 2 weeks ago, they were twigs. That's resurrection. That's the season that we are. And then the summer comes, and we just don't pay attention anymore. It's all green and lovely. So that's what this Sunday is about. When you pass the little Easter garden that we built, the children built at confirmation class, it was all filled with flowers, and now they're all disappearing. Now shamrocks are coming out of the tomb. Looks like a little leprechaun has been there. But that too is waning. And so how do we feed, how do we live resurrection so that it's not about Easter, but how do we live resurrection in our lives as the people of God? How do we find inspiration? And John's gospel is this glorious kind of bridge. It's a bridge between an era, a difficult era for the church, but they were looking and investing in us in the future. Help me, you idiots. Jesus is saying, help me, you idiots. And I wonder what that means for us today. What does that mean for us in the church today, in the world? And I'm one of the great joys in my ministry right now is working with our confirmation class. We have these, 10 young people who are dealing with living in the world, living in the real world, in the sarkos, in flesh and blood, and what these metaphors, this language of God, how do we make it relevant to them? And they're really smart kids. They're asking really good questions. And how do we prepare? How do we create a bridge so that the faith is alive and resurrection is not something that is about after this life, but about how do we give people hope and resurrection and newness and renewal? And how do we help people live faith? And it's been a great experience, and they asked some really good questions. And it's clear to me that the future of religion, the future of Christianity, it must engage science. That we have to connect somehow that science has its own theological language of mystery. And that Christianity isn't opposed to that, like some alternative creationism. We have to engage science. And we also have to engage, because many of these children are so over-functioning. The world that we have created, I look at their schedule and what they do every week and homework and the pressure to get into the right kindergarten so that you can go to Yale or Harvard, and you're paying $50,000 a year. How do we deal? What tools do they need to be human, to be sarkos, and to live a life that is glorious and not be overwhelmed? And so that's an invitation for us to think about how we do that, how we share the faith, how we model to them what Jesus is praying for his disciples. This Sunday, we are invited by the diocese to also reflect and support the wonderful work of Episcopal Charities. And Jim Tozer was on the board. Jim Florak from our congregation now serves on the board. And fortunately, Jim Florak could not be here today. But it's an organization that does amazing work day in, day out around the diocese. And it's dealing with sarkos. It's dealing with feeding and flesh and blood and real people and jobs and hopelessness and injustice and racism. Every day, 90 parishes receive support. So this is one of the ways in which we can continue to build that glorious space that is God's house of welcome for everyone. So I'm not sure what this means in your life. Resurrection becomes for us a kind of mantra. It's interesting, last week I was on retreat with the clergy of the diocese, and the retreat leader gave us a wonderful metaphor. She was talking about one of the things that the church can help people deal with in the modern age. And it's about looking beyond this life into the future, into eternity. And she described it as that most of us live in this basket. Our life, our body, our jobs, our family, our home, our community, they're in this basket that is contained. And that's our world that we know. And what we're not aware of often is that we're part of an even larger basket. And every now and again, we'll peep through the weave and we'll look outside our little basket. And we become aware that there's another basket. And as we grow older, our basket begins to fall apart. It begins to disintegrate. And that can be physical. It can be that our bodies begin to fall apart and we get sick. And then we become aware that there is another basket, that we are part of the everlasting arms of God, and that Jesus, the resurrected one, builds that bridge just as John's gospel is building that bridge for us to look at the larger basket. It's a wonderful metaphor. And so what we are about in this place, whether we're building a cathedral or we're writing a gospel or we're preparing our children for the future, is to look beyond this basket. And that is what Jesus' prayer today is about. And next week we will celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, the way in which God gives us the gifts and the energy to bring about the transformation of the world. And there's one of the things that I'm certainly going to be talking about it next week. But there's a wonderful phrase in the gospel around Whitsunday that talks about the power of God is given so that each hears in their own language, in their own way, the mighty acts of God. And it's more than French and Spanish and English. It's more than just language, but that each hears in their own way how they are part of a larger basket. So as we say goodbye to Easter and resurrection and John's Gospel, next week we have another part of John's Gospel, then we move into Matthew. Let us kind of savor, let us enjoy that light and that feeling and that power that is ours. Amen.